everything you need to know to validate your form using PHP starting now. On the left, we have our HTML and CSS form that we created in our last video. If you missed that video, there'll be a link up top and down below. And on the right side of my screen, I have WAMP server open, and we need this testing environment to actually test our PHP code because PHP is a server-side scripting language. If you guys need help installing WAMP server or some other popular testing environments for your server-side scripting language, I will be making a video, link up top and down below to that. First thing we need to do is actually change our index.html to index.php, so that will actually allow us to start typing up PHP code. So now that we have a PHP file ready to go, what we want to do is actually declare to our code here that we are going to be typing PHP by typing our bracket, question mark, PHP, and then our closing question mark and bracket. And that's going to declare that everything inside of this is going to be PHP code. And so we have 4 field inputs, but only 3 of them are going to be required. So we're only going to need 3 variables that will hold our error messages. So our first is going to be our name error. So that's exactly how we're going to title our variable here. We're just going to declare it with our $sign and then type name error. And then we're going to type an equal sign, and we're going to specify our phone error now. And to make this a little bit quicker, I'm going to be declaring all of these variables on the same line, and you can do that by typing your first variable equal, then your next variable name equal, and for as many variables as you want. And so now we have all of our variables declared, and what we want to do is set these all equal to an empty string by typing our quotation marks with nothing inside of them. Next, we need to set up our variables that actually grab our input values. Next, we need to create our variables that are going to be used to actually store our input data. So whatever our user inputs for our first name, phone, email, and or message, these variables are going to be used to store those input values. So first we want to have our name, then we want to have our phone, and then we want to have our email, and then we also want to have our message. And then we want to set this again to an empty string for now. So again, we have 4 input fields, but we only want 3 of them to be required. So that's why we only have 3 variables up here for our error values, and then 4 for our input values. So now we want to get into actually validating this, that now that we have our variables all set up and ready to go. So first we're going to want to start with an if statement. Inside of our if statement, we want to type server square brackets request method equals post. So all of our validation is only going to happen if our request method for our server is equal to post. And as you guys can see down below here, our method for our form is set to post. You can also use get here, but remember that these both need to be the same. So again, we want to have our name, phone, and email set to required fields. So we're going to start setting that up now. So we're going to create another if statement inside of our if statement, and this is going to test whether or not our name input was filled out. So we're going to test if our name input is empty by typing empty, and then to grab our form inputs, we want to go $_ post square bracket quotation marks and then type our name value. So what this is going to do is it's going to grab our name input, and as you guys can see down here, our input field for our name, the name attribute in our HTML is set to name. So that's where this is coming from. And then we are going to test if that input is empty or not. And then what we want to do if this is empty is we want to change our name error value to our error message, which is going to be name is required. So again, if our name value for our input in our HTML form is empty, we want to change our name error to name is required, because that's going to be our required field. And then what we also want to do is set up one more variable to actually test our validation. So we're going to call this variable validation pass, and we're going to set validation pass equal to a string of yes. But now if one of our required fields is not filled out, we want to change our validation pass variable to no. And you guys will see why this is going to be so important later on in today's video. Now we want to include our else statement. So if our input field for name is filled out, it's going to skip this and go down to our else. In our else statement, we want to change our name variable to our input value. So again, to do that, we're going to use $_ post, square parentheses, quotation marks, and name to grab our input value. Now we want to test our phone number input. So to do that, again, we want to check if this is empty or not first. And we're going to use the same method that we used for the name. And we're going to grab our phone input value. So if our phone input value is empty, we want to change our phone error variable equal to phone number is required. And then we also want to change our validation pass equal to no. Next, we're going to need to go back up to the top of our first if statement, and you want to make sure you include this here. So this is going to be our regular expression for our phone number, and this is going to test if the phone number is entered as 3 digits dash 3 digits dash 4 digits. So we're going to store this value in our phone expression like so. And then we're going to make this equal to our preg_match function. And what this does is it takes two values. The first one is going to be the regular expression, and then the second value is going to be the variable that you want to test with the regular expression. And it's going to look just like this. This regular expression is going to test if we have 3 numbers between 0 through 9, then a dash, then 3 numbers again that are 0 through 9, then a dash, then 4 numbers 0 through 9, and that's going to be our input. So now to use this value, we want to go back down to where we tested for our phone number, and then we want to use an else if statement and now test if our phone expression is false. To test if this is false, you want to type an exclamation point and then type our phone expression variable right here. And then if our phone expression is false, we want to set our phone error equal to enter the phone number in the correct format. And again, this is a string. Next, we want to set up our else statement, and our else statement is going to be just like what we did for name, except we're going to grab the phone number input value. So now we are storing our input value for our phone in our phone variable. Next, we want to check for our email input and make sure it's in the correct format that we want. So first, we need to set up a variable to test, and we're going to call this variable email check and make it equal to our input value for our email, just like so. Now we want to test if our email input is empty. So we're going to once again set up another if statement and use the empty function, and then make this equal to the input value of our email, just like so. And then if our email input is empty, we want to change our email error variable equal to email is required. And once again, we also want to change our validation pass equal to no. And I actually forgot to add this validation pass of no for our else if statement for our phone number, so I'm going to add that now. Now to test if they actually entered a correct email, we're going to go with an else if statement, and we're going to use our filter var function in PHP. And then we want to test if this is not correct, so we're going to add our exclamation point in front of that. And then we're going to use our email check variable to test if this value, so whatever is entered in our email input on our HTML form is in the correct format. And then to test for this, we want to go filter underscore validate email, just like so. So this is going to check if whatever the user enters for the email field on our HTML form is a correct email format. And so if this is incorrect, we want to set our email error variable equal to invalid email format, and then we want to again set our validation pass equal to no. Lastly, if everything is entered correctly for our email, we want to simply grab our email variable that we created and then select the input value of what the user inputted into our form by using our post email method again here. And now you don't want to forget about any of the input fields that you have that aren't required. You still want to make sure you're getting those values from your form based on your user input. So we're simply going to set our message variable equal to whatever the value in the message is by using our post again, and then use our name attribute that we used in our HTML form email here, and then that's going to select our user input. Before we move on, I want to highlight a very important factor here. The way we have our validation set up right now is correct. However, this leaves you susceptible to hackers right now because we are letting people enter whatever they want for these fields, okay? They can enter anything like JavaScript, PHP, Python, or whatever they want into these input fields. To prevent hacking, we want to set up our test input function by simply typing function, and then we're going to name this test input, and then this is going to take an argument of data like so. Now in this function, we want to make our data variable equal to trim parentheses and then data, because we want to trim this data down if our user inputs any extra spaces. Now our next one, we want to set our data equal to strip slashes, and this is not going to be necessarily useful for the validation portion, but once we get to actually setting this up and sending it to our database, strip slashes is going to make sure that our database is able to handle the data that our user inputs. Now this last one is going to be essential to keeping yourself from getting hacked. So we want to one last time set our data variable equal to HTML special characters and then data. And what HTML special characters is going to do is it's going to change whatever our user inputs in these fields on our HTML form to strictly HTML entities. This means that if somebody enters some vicious Python, some vicious PHP, JavaScript, it won't actually work correctly because that input will be corrected into HTML characters and you will not be susceptible to hacking. And then lastly, we simply want to return our data. Now going back up to the top of our validation here, we want to use our test input for each one of our values that we get here. So for example, on our name, in our last else statement that we have, we want to run our name input through our test input function to make sure that all of these are set correctly and we are not susceptible to hacking. So I'm going to go ahead and do that to each one of these variables here, and then I'll get back to you guys. So now we have our test input value on each one of our variables here in our else statement. So our name is equal to test input and then our post and name here. Same thing for our phone, same thing for our email check, same thing for our email down here, and same thing for our message. Now lastly, in our PHP up top here is where the validation pass variable is going to be important. So we want to use another if statement, and if our validation pass value here is equal to yes, then we want to run our final PHP code down below here. And now for this, we're simply going to add an echo that echoes out a quick overlay. If you guys want to learn how to create this overlay, I actually did it in another video, so there'll be a link right now for you guys. Now we want to move down to our HTML form, because this is not going to work because we don't have our form specifying any action yet. So we want to specify our action to be PHP and then echo HTML special characters and then $_server square parentheses quotation marks PHP self. And all this is going to do is it's going to make the action of our form when somebody submits this run our code here, because this code is on our current page. Most of the time when you use a action method, you will be linking to another PHP page to run the code on that page. But for this instance, we want to use it just like this. So we use the PHP code that is on our same page. And then again, you guys can see that I used HTML special characters to avoid any potential hacking, because if you don't use that, using the server PHP self method is susceptible to getting hacked. And now what we want to do is actually display our errors based on our code that we created. So what we're going to do is create a span, and I already have a class called error, and all that class does is make our text that blue color that we're using for our website, so the user can actually see it and see that they did trigger an error because they didn't enter it right. And then inside of our span, we want to again include some PHP code just like this, and then we want to echo our name error variable. So what this will do is it will display if our name error variable is set to something up here because it is empty, but this will not display if something is entered for our name input, because obviously there's something in our input field. From our last video, we are using a prevent default action down here in our JavaScript, so go ahead and comment that out or this will not work correctly. You can go ahead and delete it too. We don't really need it anymore. And then again, from our last video, we actually used a little bit of HTML to validate our form that way. So what you want to do is get rid of your HTML validation. So we have required here, we want to get rid of that, because now we're going to be using PHP. And then required again, you want to get rid of that because we don't need our HTML validation anymore. Now in our WAMP server, we're going to open our form and actually start doing some testing. Now, as you guys can see in your WAMP server or in your amps, you will get errors if you coded something incorrectly. So the error that I actually made was I included a closing bracket here for our first if statement, when that closing bracket actually needs to go underneath our last input, just like so. So as you guys can see, it is printing out our value that is name is required. And now we want to go back to our HTML form and we want to include this same span on each one of our input fields that are going to be required, and simply change out our variable. So here for our email, this is going to be our email error, and then for our phone, it's going to be our phone error instead. So now we're going to go back and test, and as you guys can see, it's displaying name is required, email is required, phone number is required. So if I fill out something for my name here, that will go away, okay? And then if I fill out a valid email, so we'll use our business email here of Kalman Web Design @gmail.com to show you guys that this does in fact work now. And then if we go ahead and hit submit, that error will go away. And then our phone number, if we enter numbers in here that are incorrect from our regular expression that we created, this enter the phone number in the correct format will display, because there is something in the field, so it's not empty, but it does not have the right value entered in there. Now let's test it with a valid phone number, and this is going to be our phone number at Kalman Web Design if you guys want to give us a call right here. So we'll use that one to test this out. So now you guys can see we have 3 numbers, a dash, 3 numbers, a dash, and 4 numbers. And now that error message will go away. And then for our message, it's not a required field, so if you don't fill it out, there's not going to be an error or anything like that. And most of the time, our first name and last name will actually be separate inputs, but for this video, I just combined them to kind of condense the video a little bit for you guys. Now, lastly, what we want to do is actually keep our values if something is entered incorrectly, because it's really annoying when you go to a form and it removes all your inputs when only one input was entered incorrectly. Go back to each one of your HTML input elements and set a value attribute. So we want to set our value equal to a PHP block of code here. And inside of that PHP block of code, we're going to use an if statement. So we're going to say if our name is set, that's what question mark null means. We want to echo in HTML entities our name value here in our input field. And so now it's not working, and what's actually happening here is I entered the wrong variable here. So when we actually correct the name of our variable, it will now work. So make sure you guys type out your variables in the right way. So now you guys can see these error messages are popping up, but it is keeping our first name input right here, which is exactly what you want. You only want the user to have to go back and refill out the fields where they entered it incorrectly. So going back to our HTML form, we're going to copy this value and then just change it out to all of your variables for your phone number, email. So now we have our value attribute set for our name input, our email input, and our phone input. But lastly, our message is set to a text area and not an input. So this one will not accept a value attribute in the opening tag. So what you want to do is actually include your PHP code right between your opening HTML tag and your closing tag here, just like I'm going to do, and then obviously change this out to the correct variable. So now you guys can see that my PHP code is between the opening text area tag and our closing text area tag. Let's enter everything except our email correctly, and it's going to keep our values. And so now if you guys can see, it's keeping our first and last name input and our phone input, but our message is not staying. And that's because I messed up our message input variable up here, and I actually need to change email to message. So make sure you guys keep an eye. It's really inevitable that you'll program something wrong. So when something doesn't work correctly, make sure you check all your spellings, all your variable names, make sure everything is equal to the value that you want. So now if we save and test it again, it will now keep our message value. But if we enter everything correctly now, and then go ahead and hit submit, it's actually going to show our overlay, and then it's going to keep our form values in each one of our input fields, because the default action for a form is to remove all of the input fields once you hit submit. And what we're doing is we're actually overriding that and forcing this form to keep our input values. So to correct this issue, and this is extremely important if you're dealing with sensitive info, because you don't want this to be left anywhere on the web where somebody can take it and scam somebody or take a credit card number, somebody's social security number. So to correct this issue, we want to one more time go back up to our PHP code that we started on here, and then if our validation pass equals yes, the first thing we want to do is clear all our input fields. So we want to make our name, phone, email, and message variables that contain our input values and make those equal to empty strings again. And now you guys will see that if we go back over here and test it out, it will remove all of our input field values once we submit everything correctly. So here is our finalized form created using HTML and CSS and validated with PHP. Now if we hit submit, everything works correctly, and then if we submit anything incorrectly, our error messages will all display as I am showing here. Let me know if you guys have any questions. I know this can be confusing as a beginner. Reach out to us through this video or go to our website at kalmanwebdesign.com and we will help you out. Thanks for watching.